Well, joining me now from Denver is Chris Hansen. He's a state legislator in Colorado's House of Representatives. And from Washington, D.C., we have Brent Skorup. He is a senior research fellow in the Technology Policy Program at George Mason University, and he serves on the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. Now, we invited the FCC to join us on the program. Unfortunately, they declined our invitation. Well, let's get straight to it. Let me start with Brent. If the argument goes, internet service providers can make a fortune, like telecoms, for example, charging customers monthly subscription fees or usage fees, why not protect net neutrality? Why put the web at the potential mercy of corporate interests?
Thank you, thank you for having me. So net neutrality, it's come to mean a lot of different terms. In 2015, the Obama administration urged the FCC, the communications and media regulator, to regulate internet service providers. The order doesn't get at that competitive issue that you mentioned, this idea of them raising rates. That's a competitive issue, and the FCC in the order says competition is not really what the rules are getting at. We have competition agencies, we have the Federal Trade Commission, we have the DOJ, and those are the proper agencies to police pricing and the abuse of market power. And that existed before the 2015 rules, that existed after 2015 rules. And with the repeal of the 2015 rules, that goes back, the authority to police competition goes back to the Federal Trade Commission.
Okay, Chris Hansen, does that sound fair?
Well, I think there's a serious problem that is not being addressed. And the way we've tried to approach it in Colorado is that we want to protect Colorado taxpayers from possible abuse from internet providers. And so it's fine to say that we want lots of competition, but the problem is in rural areas of the U.S., there's typically only one provider. And in Colorado, like many other states, we use state resources to make sure that the rural areas have service. And if those providers are now able to charge for fast lanes, those consumers are not going to have any choice and no protection left because of the change of the FCC. So I think in rural areas of the U.S. where there's only one provider, there's a big problem that's going to be brewing here.
Brett, then how do you mitigate that? For areas where there only is one provider, competition doesn't matter. They're at the mercy of that one system.
Yeah, that's an important issue, rural coverage and the number of providers in rural areas. That's not a net neutrality issue. And the 2015 order is clear that the rules are not about competitive threats. So the U.S. in the past 20 years has spent about $100 billion on rural telecommunications and broadband services. It might not be spent ideally, but there is investment, and that's the purpose of universal service funds. That's not a net neutrality issue, but that's an important issue. Net neutrality comes with all this baggage in the U.S. because what the FCC did in 2015 was they had to use a regulatory hook, and what they said is, internet service looks like telephone and telegraph, and we can use our telephone and telegraph regulations, what's called Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. We're going to use this Title II regulations on the internet, and that's not a good policy. That's not the policy we had when the U.S. became a leader in telecommunications and internet technology, and it's also, it violates federal policy. So in 1996, the Republican Congress, Democrat Bill Clinton, passed a law saying that it's the policy of the United States that the internet, and specifically internet access, should be unfettered from federal and state regulation. And in 2015, for political reasons, the FCC decided to regulate the internet, and it violates the policy of the United States, the successful policy of the United States, to leave the internet to the marketplace and to competition agencies.
Chris, there is a problem here in that, even as I'm listening to some of these explanations, when you get down to the details in these laws, it just gets confusing. You run the risk of consumers giving up and feeling like, okay, you know what, this is just like watching television or listening to the radio. There are going to be some advertisers in there that maybe I don't want to hear, but they're going to be part of this, and I am kind of comfortable with what, consumers just have to get used to. Is that what might happen here because these laws are so confusing?
Well, yeah, and I think it's not just, am I seeing advertising I don't like? I think the threat is a little bit more serious than that. And So again, going back to, you're in a small town, and in this case, rural Colorado, up in the mountains, you've got one provider who has been brought to your home with universal service funds, so taxpayer money. And that provider perhaps bids out that service at a very low rate, but then tries to make up the difference by charging you extra to see certain content, or throttling, or creating paid fast lanes. And now that the net neutrality protections are gone, that consumer really has no choice and no protection from that type of service. And so I don't think it's just advertising. It could be a situation where, a piece of content that they want is going to be slowed down or blocked, or they're going to have to pay extra to get it. And I think if you play that scenario out over lots of different companies, lots of different content, you have a very dangerous situation for the American taxpayer. And I think that's what we were trying to do in Colorado, is prevent that scenario. So anytime taxpayer money is being used to provide service, we want to make sure it's net neutral service, and that there isn't that extra paid fast lane or throttling problem that could occur now that we've had this change at the FCC.
Okay, Brent, I'm going to go back to my initial question with you, because I just want you to, if you can, give me a simple answer. Why aren't subscription and monthly usage fees enough for these internet service providers? As I said, telecom's made a fortune off of that. Why can't we just leave it with monthly usage and subscription fees?
So you see this in many businesses, not just the internet, where it's called a double-sided market, where you have multiple inputs. And so advertising is another example, in TV marketplace. Cable operators make money off subscriptions. They also make it off advertising. And so there are different business models for this. And with the internet, what you're seeing is that large, particularly video companies like Netflix and YouTube and Facebook, they require a lot of infrastructure to serve consumers. And so these companies have paid a lot of money to build their own private internets to consumer broadband lines. And there are disputes, there will be disputes about how to allocate that fairly. And that's a commercial dispute, and there are certainly important competition problems. But to me, that's not a net neutrality problem. That's not what the 2015 rules are intended to handle.
Okay. I mean, Chris, the argument for critics that believe in net neutrality say, the difference with the internet is that it's such tailored information and such personal communication. Is that what you feel as well? I mean, that any time you get big business interested in making this a market similar to what Brent was saying with cable providers, you risk all sorts of issues of free speech and everything else that come with that.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's what we were so concerned about in Colorado. And as you mentioned in the lead up to our time together, this is across many states in the U.S. are worried about this exact same problem. Free speech, access to new commercial business models, making sure that people can express themselves and receive the information that they want. All of those things could be under threat here, and I think that's why people across the country have reacted so strongly, and why we decided to bring the legislation forward in Colorado to address that problem. I mean, this gets to the fundamental bedrocks of a free and open society, and the ability to talk to your friends, to express your ideas, to be successful in a commercial way with, you mentioned startups and new innovative companies. All of those things could be threatened if we make major changes in the way that content is transmitted across the internet. And so I think, with the FCC protections now removed, it's incumbent on the states to act. And that's really, I think, the crux of what we were trying to do here in Colorado.
Okay, and Brent, I mean, we heard in that report that the UN believes, the United Nations believes, there could be global implications for what the United States does in this space and how it tries to change general net neutrality. And another problem here is that, people have compared this to corporate interests versus the same lines as government censorship, government interference in internet content. Do you see any validity in that? Because this is what the globe actually fears happening. Instead of governments interfering, it will be corporate interests interfering in what we can access on the World Wide Web.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize there are large corporate interests on both sides of this debate. I mean, you tend to have internet service providers on one side, and you have large tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Netflix on the other. So there's corporate interests on both sides. The concern I have is that by regulating internet using its Title II regulation, that's the strictest regulatory regime the FCC has as disposal. And so that's bringing the internet closer to the government. And in the past, the FCC has not been friendly to consumers and to competition. And I don't think that's a good message to send anywhere. And it violates U.S. policy, which is that the internet should be free of regulation. I'd also like to make a subtle but important point, which is with all this baggage that comes with Title II, a perverse incentive came out of the 2015 rules. So in the 2015 rules, the FCC said essentially, if you look like a telephone company, we're going to regulate you like a telephone company. And this is conventional broadband. They said, it looks like telephone, we're going to regulate it like telephone. In litigation, it came out that the judge asked the FCC lawyer, the Obama FCC lawyer, what if an internet service provider blocks content? And this is kind of the fear of net neutrality proponents. What if they block content? And the Obama FCC lawyer said, if they filter content they don't wish to distribute, they drop out of the rules. They're less regulated if they filter content than if they offer conventional broadband. This is a very perverse incentive to internet service providers because they're less regulated if they filter content. And this is something that the Trump FCC noted when it repealed the rules, was that this is not a good incentive for ISPs, that they're less regulated when they block content.
Okay, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the average citizen is not worried about Title II. They're worried about getting the content that they would like to access and not having the threat of being throttled or having to pay extra for it. So, I think this is an important policy debate at the federal level and whether it should be in Title I, Title II, et cetera. But I think we're talking about a much more of a kitchen table type issue here, and one that gets to the heart of who we are as Americans. So, I would agree we want to have less regulation here where we can possibly reduce regulation, but we have a new problem that's been created by changing the FCC oversight, and that is that we now open up business models that could be very abusive to American consumers. And I think we've got to get serious about addressing that problem, because as this plays out, you could have some very serious repercussions for the average American. And as you mentioned, Andrea, this could ripple across the world. So it's a complicated issue, no doubt. The internet is worldwide. It's not like one state or one jurisdiction can change the entire setup. But I think we have to take this threat very seriously and be proactive about it. And that was really my worry with the change at the FCC level late last year.
Brent, let me just put this to you before we go. The Federal Trade Commission's acting chairman, another Trump appointee like Ajit Pai, the current chief of the FCC, said she believes there's a lack of confidence in market forces and that antitrust laws are really enough to protect consumers. Do you believe that's true?
So I agree with Chris. The competition problems are real, but they won't be fixed. I disagree in that the FCC can fix them. The FCC, we must remember, a lot of the competition problems are because for decades, the U.S. government, state governments, and the FCC allowed one phone provider in every locality and one cable provider in every locality. So this was government regulation that gave us only a handful of providers. And so I don't think the remedy can be, we need government regulation to fix this competition problem. I think the competition laws are adequate. We certainly don't have the ideal situation, but there's been a lot of investment in these companies. And mobile, in fact, is becoming increasingly a substitute for landline broadband service. So these things are getting better. And I'll add, this to me is the real tragedy of the net neutrality debate, because we have this very partisan fight at this point when about these very complicated issues about the baggage of Title II regulation, when the FCC could have spent the past decade looking at investment. How do we get USF, Universal Service Funds, into rural areas? How do we get broadband deployment into rural and underserved areas? But this net neutrality fight has distracted the FCC. It's become a top priority, and which is why I'm encouraged that last year Ajit Pai, Chairman Pai, created the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, of which I'm a part, to look at these issues. What are cities doing that might inhibit broadband deployment? What are competitors doing that might inhibit broadband deployment? And to me, that's where the focus should be, not on net neutrality.
Chris, quick final words, because I can see you have something to say.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Andrea. So I just wanted to mention, I mean, it was brought up that this was a partisan fight, and I actually don't see it that way at all. 83% of Americans in the latest polls that I've seen want to see net neutrality protections. This is wide, broad consensus that we need to make sure consumers are protected. 83% of Americans want this. It's not breaking down on partisan lines. The vast majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents want to make sure that consumers are protected. And so I think we need to stay true to those desires and protect the American public.
Okay, and we will have to leave it there. I'd like to thank both of our guests so much for joining us on this segment of the Newsmakers.